Welcome to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy, and I direct the Michael C. McFarland S.J. Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The college just announced this weekend that the center is being named in honor of Father McFarland, who will step down at the end of this calendar year after 12 years as college president. We're deeply honored to have Father McFarland's name attached to the center for the standard of excellence that it sets for us and for Jesuit liberal arts education today. You can read about the announcement and view our upcoming programs, watch lectures, including eventually this one, online at holycross.edu/CREC, C-R-E-C, or later, if you want to be even more up-to-date, holycross.edu/McFarland Center. But it'll take a while to make that transition for everyone. This afternoon, we're pleased to present a lecture by Monica Duffy Toft on the resurgence of religion in global politics. The talk is one of the Deitchman family lectures on religion and modernity, a series that explores the place of religious and spiritual life in a world that's sometimes at odds with faith, other times in search of it, but always at work reshaping it. Monica Duffy Toft is Associate Professor of Public Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and Director of the Initiative on Religion and International Affairs. She was a 2008 Carnegie Scholar. I gather she was also Professor Ward Thomas's suite mate once, but I don't know what the cause and effect years ago. Professor Toft is a co-author of God's Century, Resurgent Religion and Global Politics with Dan Philpott and Timothy Samuel Shaw, and author of Securing the Peace, The Durable Settlement of Civil Wars, and again, The Geography of Ethnic Conflict, Identity, Interests, and Territory. She's co-editor of The Fog of Peace, Strategic and Military Planning Under Uncertainty. Professor Toft has written opinion pieces for The Australian, Boston Globe, Christian Science Monitor, Dallas Morning News, International Herald Tribune, and the Washington Post, and you can frequently read her work on the Huffington Post. So please join me in welcoming Monica Duffy Toft.
Well, thanks, Tom. And Ward and I were actually postdoc fellows at Harvard, and it was a wonderful experience, and it's nice to be back here. And it's a pleasure to be at the College of the Holy Cross and quite appropriately discussing the global resurgence of religion. And much of the book that Dan, Tim, and I wrote was sort of about state-church relations, and one of the reasons why this college is here is to sort of separate it from Boston so that there wouldn't be as much state control. So it's appropriate that I'm sort of talking about these sorts of dynamics. So as Professor Landry said, I'm going to be talking about a book that I recently published with my co-authors Dan Philpott at Notre Dame, another great Catholic university, and Timothy Samuel Shaw, who is down at Georgetown, another Catholic university, and I happen to be Catholic as well. And it is not a Catholic treatise. If anything, what we're trying to do is examine religion writ large. Catholicism does emerge in the book actually as a very prominent and in many ways positive force, especially when it comes to the termination of wars and peace and reconciliation. Many of the concepts of reconciliation that we understand today in the resolving of disputes and conflicts actually emerges out of religious theologies of religion. So the book was a culmination of about a decade. We started this before 9/11. I was part of a very junior, in fact, it was the beginning part of my career, team that Samuel Huntington, who I think is probably one of the world's leading, if not preeminent, political scientists. He actually wrote a leading book in every subfield of political science. Anyway, he was working on he had just finished his Clash of Civilizations, and in his work, Civilizations in many ways is sort of a shorthand for religion and culture. And so he brought together a team of scholars, junior and senior, to look at this global resurgence of religion. And I had been working on ethnicity, so my first book was looking at ethnic violence. So what are the conditions under which ethnic conflict? So you have two groups that are already mobilized, that are already sort of antagonistic and positioned against one another. Under what conditions is violence going to emerge? And you can think about Northern Ireland, the Protestants and the Catholics, where religion wasn't actually central, but it helped to define who was going to fight against whom. And so Sam had noticed that I had done a lot of work on ethnic violence, and he invited me on. And it turned out that Dan, Tim, and I were the junior partners in this, and we decided that we were going to write sort of the volume, the book, that captures some of the main findings about whether indeed there is a global resurgence, what does that global resurgence look like, what has led to that global resurgence, what are some of the factors, and then what are the implications and what can we learn from it. So the next slide. So that's the book. You can go purchase it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Keep going. This is going to be a little awkward. So there's secular suspicions, and the idea of secularism is the idea that church and state should be separate, and that religion, if it's going to remain, is going to be largely a private matter, that it wasn't going to be in the public sphere. Part of the slide, for some reason, is not translating. Some people were out of college here. I was told you guys are really smart undergrads. There's a line that's supposed to be up there that says religion and the 4 Ds, so religion receiving Ds. The first is that secularism, or theorists of secularism, predicted that religion would disappear. Next. That religion, here it is, religion deserves 4 Ds. That religion would decline, that while as it's disappearing, that even those people who had faith, that the intensity of it was going to decline. Next. That it was going to be dictatorial, that if it existed, it was going to be highly autocratic, it was going to determine people, the behavior of people, and not only the behavior, but freedom of conscience and ideas, and that it was going to be divisive. And so that was sort of, for a long time, sort of the common wisdom about the role of religion, that it was going to be gone, that it was disappearing from the public arena, and that if it existed, it would be in the private arena, and that it was divisive, and so that this was a good thing, that we wanted religion actually out of the public square, out of the political arena. But it turns out, and this book spends a lot of time going through that that's not the case. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about the global resurgence, and we tie it to 3 trends: modernization theory, which some of you in political science and sociology probably have studied, democratization, so as countries move to becoming more open, 1 man, 1 vote, majority rule, or proportional representation, the idea that individuals can determine their governments, as we saw in the Arab Spring most recently. Globalization, the ease with which ideas, bodies, goods go across borders. And then I'm going to sum up with some implications and conclusions from the research. The next slide. So, is God dead? And modernization theory predicted that, yes, it is dead, but we make the argument, we turn it on its head and said, okay, there's specific traditions, predictions about modernization theory that no, that modernization, the exact trends that were supposed to have led to religion's demise actually propelled religion into the political arena and made it much more public and much more intense. Next slide. So what was the main explanation for sort of the death of religion in the public arena? One was that no longer were people going to be driven by group identities, that individual fate was going to be a matter of personal choice. And so as individuals moved sort of off of the farm into urban areas, into businesses and that sort of thing, they were no longer going to have to be sort of at the whims of nature and at the whims of others. They could individually determine their own fate. And that's critical, individual choice at that point. And that the prediction from that was that people wouldn't choose to have faith, that they would choose some sort of monetary or market sort of mechanisms and satisfactions. Modernization theory is hooked in with development, the idea that as societies modernize and industrialize, that it was going to mean an end to poverty and war. I mean, these are the predictions that these scholars were making. Peter Berger was probably one of the most prominent. And that if they existed, religious, cultural, and linguistic traditions, they would go and they would be private. Languages were supposed to sort of homogenize. We're seeing some of that with English being a dominant language. But the idea was that there was going to be sort of this emergence of this cosmopolitan person who was individually determined, and group identities were going to diminish. And among those group identities was going to be religious faith. Next slide. And secularization was going to be the new norm, meaning there was going to be a separation of church and state. There was not going to be a public face, a public place for religion. In 1966, Time magazine published this very famous cover asking the question, is God dead? And predicted that indeed it is dead. And Peter Berger, who is at Boston University, in fact, Professor Landry and I were just talking about Boston University, he predicted that if religious individuals, if people had religious beliefs still existed, they'd be cowering in isolation in corners, that they would be alone, and that in some sense they would be foolish if they were doing that. And so we don't think that modernization theory is completely wrong. In fact, if you look at some of the data, it turns out one of my co-authors worked at the Pew Forum, which has some of the best data on religion and religious beliefs in the United States and then globally. And you can see that in many corners of the world, especially in the OECD countries, these are the organization for countries that are economically developed, as in Europe, Western European states, and then Japan, the level of religious belief actually is not that high. However, there's a really important outlier, which is the United States. It turns out that Americans, as we all know, are a highly religious population. And so on the one hand, there does seem to be evidence that in Western European countries, France, only 27 and 11% see religion as very important in their lives. In the United States, upwards of 80% of Americans see that. So in some corners of the world, indeed, modernization theory does seem to be operating, meaning that people do not find faith as important in their lives. But the point of that slide is to show that they're really important outliers. Relatedly, belief in God has declined. So that last slide was sort of the OECD countries. This is the 12 high-income countries. You can see that whether God was important in the 16 high-income countries, that's Italy, France, Germany, Ireland, the UK more generally, it was never that high. But importantly, this data shows, this Pew, that it's been coming down over time. So modernization theory it seems to have some traction in some parts of the world. Next slide. And then another question, follow on. What's nice about these sets of surveys is this takes us into Africa, Asia, beyond the OECD and beyond the developed countries. And what you find is that other parts of the world beyond Western Europe, beyond Japan, you actually have high levels of religiosity. And not only that, people believe that their moral, independent, individual ethical code, and I'm sure you guys, you take a core course in ethics here, in morality, I'm sure. No? Oh.
Not a core course.
Okay, well, in any event, you can see that in many corners of the world that there's a belief, a fundamental foundational belief that you have to believe in God in order to act morally. However, as you can see, it's divided between the OECD countries and the rest of the world. So we look at these data and we say, yes, there seems to be some truth to the modernization thesis in some parts of the world, but it's a very small portion of the world. In fact, in most parts of the world, religion is actually quite strong, and they seem to be the exceptions. The OECD countries, the developed countries, and the rest of the world is not. Upwards of 82% of the world believes in religion. Todd Johnson and Brian Grimm do a lot of collection of data, and that number is increasing actually. That it used to, about 5 years ago, it was 78% of the world believed in God. Now it's 82%. In fact, the proportion of atheists is declining, which is really striking. And some people say it's because people in China, right, which used to categorize themselves as atheists, are now more freely saying that they're religious. And so if you look at it worldwide, globally, the proportion of people who say that they believe in God has gone up. So next slide. So we make the case that God is not dead, and we track through in the first couple of chapters some key religious events. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, there's a general sense of moral decline and malaise. And there were some critical social things that happened and legal things. We had a born-again president in Jimmy Carter. The students here would not remember this, but he sort of wore his religion on the sleeve. And some presidents have, but he in particular really did in an era that Time magazine is predicting that religion should not be publicly expressed. Roe v. Wade, which I'm sure you all know about, which legalized abortion in this country. It really mobilized people who thought that, no, you need to defend life, that every degree of life requires human dignity. And so it sort of mobilized the moral majority in this country, starting in the 1970s, and then, of course, through the 80s and into the 90s, and I think manifested most recently in George Bush and sort of the evangelicals. Abroad, you had failure of post-colonial independence. And here the argument is that modernization theory was applied. So you had a lot of leaders in the 1940s and 50s, many of whom were actually trained at Oxford, Harvard, College of the Holy Cross, and they were taught about Marxism, capitalism, liberalism, and they took these ideas home and they tried to implement governance systems based on these, and many of them failed. Actually, so the idea is that the local populations, the indigenous populations, after the colonial powers were thrown off, they were given a decade, 2 decades, a generation or so to sort of deliver the goods on their own, and they didn't do it. And so people were looking elsewhere, and religion had always been there, right? That people had always had their faith, the organizations and the networks and institutions were there, and so they could tap into that. The 1967 war, we've had some amazing events going on in the Middle East. And we think, to some extent, that it was underestimated the degree to which it mattered that the Jewish community, the Israeli state, which represents the Jewish community, got control of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, which is contested by Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And that had a profound sort of mobilizing effect in the Muslim world, and to some extent in the Christian world. And then liberation theology, you should know about that here, which is the idea that even the most impoverished should be lifted up, and that you could challenge, and actually lay and clerical authorities started challenging autocratic regimes, dictatorial regimes, particularly in Latin America. And then, of course, the mother of them all is the Iranian Revolution, which brought in sort of a politically theologically driven regime in Iran, which used to be an ally of the United States. And this is a case of a true theological revolution where there was a reinterpretation of what it means to be a Shia and whether you could challenge political authority. And Khomeini, they started doing this, promulgating these ideas in the universities in the 60s and 70s, and then sort of brought them to fruition in 1979. It wasn't inevitable the Iranian Revolution was going to be a religious revolution, but they were able to capitalize on their networks and institutions. And of course, the idea is that a Shia didn't have to necessarily be a martyr in the same way that Ali, the father was, the prophet was, that they could challenge political authorities. It was a really important shift. And then in the 1980s and 90s, you see the emergence of the Branch Davidians. And what was really interesting about that is the US government didn't know what to do with these guys. They did not really believe that they were following the book, the Bible. They didn't understand what it was. It was a real eye-opening call, and calling religious studies scholars saying, what does this mean? What is this book of Revelation? And what is that? Are they really doing this? And not really sort of taking it seriously. Overseas in the 1980s, you have John Paul II, profound impact, right? He went and he sort of challenged the regimes, in particular in Eastern Europe. It mattered that he was of Polish descent. He was seen as the Polish Pope, and he could sort of wag his finger. It had an effect on these regimes that somebody from the outside, in particular a religious authority with a religious elite with authority from elsewhere, was able to challenge the regimes. Afghanistan, the global jihad was started in the 70s and then into the 80s, and it's continuing today into the 21st century. And they overthrew a nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union. And guess what? They're giving the United States and its allies a hard time today. And then the communist collapse, and then the spread of democratization. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on democratization, of which the communist collapse in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union had an impact. Next slide. So most of the world, so hopefully after this sort of overview, most of the world is in fact becoming more religious. The data show this. And not only that, not only people personally becoming more intense in their faith, but they're becoming more public with it. And they're also demanding, in many corners of the world, there's some exceptions, surveys show that their political leaders also exude some sort of religiosity or display this within the public arena. An exception is Pakistan today because of all the religious strife that it's been facing, but generally speaking, the numbers are still pretty high even in Pakistan. And we make the case that modernization theory does hold in some corners of the world, but where it holds, those are outlier states or outlier regions, and that's Western Europe and Japan. And actually, one of the best treatments of this is Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart's book, The Sacred and the Secular. And if you actually eyeball and look at their charts, even in those countries where we're willing to concede ground, where we think that they're actually right in some corners, even their levels are still pretty high. They're up to 40 to 60%. That to me does not mean that religion is disappeared and that it is declining, but it hasn't necessarily disappeared. If you look at the adherence, I already told you some of the data. The most recent data hasn't been published yet, the 2010 data. You can see that proportion of the world who identify with one of the major religious traditions has been increasing, and the projections are by 2025 upwards of 69%, 70% are going to abide by one of the major religious traditions. Catholicism is holding its own. Protestantism is holding its own, but within Protestantism, the mainline churches are sort of losing ground to sort of the evangelical, what we think of as the storefront, individual pastors starting a church. But Catholicism is doing fine. And then, of course, in the Muslim and the Hindu community, part of this is growth of population in India is driving the Hindu, but also There's a big Hindu nationalist movement in India that people are now starting to say, yes, I want to identify and publicly declare myself to be a Hindu. Next slide. So the cause of the global resurgence. Again, you've already seen this, that we think it's a convergence of modernization, its failure to deliver. That in many parts of the world where these theories of modernization, again, socialism, communism, Baathism, right? The United States, when it went into Iraq in 2003, overthrew Baathism, which was a socialist idea, where the state's going to sort of determine the economy and politics. It failed to deliver. And so people are looking for alternative sources of legitimacy and authority, sort of governing principles, and religion was there. And the institutions and networks were there. Democratization, it's promised to deliver. Again, so we're saying that those ideas that were supposed to have undermined religion actually empowered religious actors. The individual is empowered within religious traditions. So sociologists of religion sort of got it wrong, that actually religion gives people a sense of power and authority. And so when democratization comes to their doorstep, they're willing to challenge political authorities and say, I have a voice. And then finally is globalization. And some people make the case that the late 19th century, early 20th century was a highly globalized place. This is not new. But I'm going to show you a chart that's pretty striking, that yes, we had globalization in the late 19th and 20th century, and bodies and goods and everything were transferring across borders. But the intensification, the rapidity with which ideas are changed, we think that this has led to a qualitative shift. So the quantitative shift is so great that it's a qualitative shift. So the three key aspects: modern secular ideologies have failed to eradicate poverty, disease, and war. I'm a student of war. And civil wars, are one of they actually lead to the largest level of destruction today. And this has created a backlash in many corners of the world. And then communications, again, this is back to globalization. It facilitates the ability of individuals acting as part of the group within a religious community to coordinate their activities, to network, right, to share ideas. And so ideas are transcending boundaries in a much easier way than before. So, I put up that slide from before with the OECD countries. So yes, there's a decline in religion in some corners of the world, but a demise? I don't think so, because if you look, even in the 12 high-income countries, 60% still believe in God. So the people who are making the argument that the decline means disappearance, they're sort of they're overstretching the argument. They're making the case too strongly. Okay, so the first was modernization. The second trend, I'm going to give you some data on democratization. And it turns out that democratization is wonderful, right? We know this. We live in one of the most democratic countries in the world. But it's a messy, messy, and divisive business, right? So who's it? Madison, that truth emerges from conflict, right? And the reason is it opens up the political space to multiple views. And religious actors were one of those who sort of injected themselves into the political arena. Ayatollah Khomeini, right, sort of challenging the Shah of Iran. Democratization allows for new actors to come in, and old actors are exited, either peacefully or in some cases not so peacefully. This is what the Arab Spring was all about, although there wasn't a heavy religious component to the Arab Spring, and we can talk about that if you want. And then some democracies do privilege minority views, but I think if you do your political theory and everything else, there seems to be this gut human instinct about majority rule, that societies need to be governed by sort of ideas that most people in the community hold, or that are at least tolerated, right? So democracies, it's really a lot about toleration and tolerance. So next slide. And you can see this is data based on Freedom House, which tracks the degree of openness in societies across the world. And since 1972, indeed, the proportion of states that have more democratic systems, not completely democratic, but more democratic, more open, if you want, you can think less autocracy, has been on the march. And that proportion, so the green line is the one, and you can see the number of autocracies has been on the decline. And then anocracies are regimes that are partially open. It turns out that, if you think about US foreign policy, there's sort of four table legs to U.S. foreign policy. One is free trade. We like free trade. We like open markets. Another is controlling weapons of mass destruction. We get quite nervous. Why we're nervous about Iran. Another is we don't like regional hegemons. Why we didn't like Saddam Hussein. And the third, of course, is human rights and democratization. But the problem as a policy is that as scholars of democratization, how do you get from those autocracies or those anocratic systems, these in-between systems, to democracy? because it turns out that getting there is prone to violence. The most violence-prone systems are these sort of anacratic systems. And so I'm going to show you some data about civil wars and terrorism. And indeed, it's during this period where you have this opening up. People talk about the third wave of democratization. And some people are saying we're now in the fourth wave of democratization, that it's hitting the Arab world. And so, so democratization is rife. It opens up sort of the political arena to not only peaceful transitions, but violent transitions. So, you know, one of the questions in the book we want to look at is what was the role of religious actors? Because the conventional wisdom, people would say, well, they tend to be reactionary, conservative, against changing the status quo. Well, it turns out it's not the case, right? So we cataloged all democratization since 1972, the countries that underwent transitions, and this is a change in the Freedom House score by at least 3 to 4 points. And it turns out that in 63% of the cases, so this is all the cases of countries that have experienced substantial democratization, so movement toward a more open political system. And religious actors were involved in a majority of them. So Tom, do you want to do the next slide? And so in 63%, there were 78 cases, or 62%. In 48 of 78% of the cases, the global cases, religious actors played a substantial role. We were struck by that. We actually didn't know where that number was going to come out until we cataloged it. And so religious actors were sort of there trying to propel it forward. Not in every case. In some cases, they pushed back, or they allied themselves with the government and pushed back, right? So they didn't want to move forward. So religious actors push for freedom, but they are also, in some cases, we know that religious actors use faith and use violence together. And so, as I said, I already talked about this process of democratization. One of the laws is that this transition to democracy is fraught with a higher likelihood of violence emerging. And so one of the things that happens is civil wars within societies. And indeed, we see that if you look at the data and the proportion of civil wars. And again, we're interested in religious actors, the role of religious ideas and religious institutions. They sort of track on the democratization, and then you also see an increase in the proportion of religious civil wars. Religious civil wars since the 1970s have been on the rise as a proportion of wars. And what I mean by that is either the combatants were fighting over religion being a central feature in politics. So you can think about Tajikistan, end of communism, and you had Islamists who really wanted a strong form of Sharia law to sort of dictate the law of the land. And then you had seculars saying, no, 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 we don't want that. And there was a civil war over that. Or they just abided by, you can think about the wars in former Yugoslavia, where you had Catholic Croats fighting Muslim Bosnians, fighting Orthodox Serbs. Religion was not a core feature. Some scholars want to argue that it absolutely was a core feature, but they weren't saying that this was going to be the dictates or the law of the land. But it did help to separate the population who was going to fight whom. So religious civil wars, the proportion, and I'll show you a graphic in a second, did increase since the 1970s as a proportion of civil wars. And today, if you look at all civil wars, they make up half of all civil wars. So either religion was a central feature or religion is peripheral in the fight, but it's still there. Okay, so the next slide. And the same thing in religiously inspired terrorism. Prior to the 1980s, this is Bruce Hoffman's work. If you guys, I think his Inside Terrorism is one of the best books on the topic. Prior to the 1980s, there was almost no religiously inspired violence. This is a relatively new phenomenon, and it emerged largely in the 1990s, and today it is the dominant form. And just as religious civil wars seem to be more intractable, lead to more deadly, are more deadly to non-combatants, religious terrorism turns out to be more deadly. In fact, religious terrorism, you know, Muslims promulgate most of it, and the victims, West Point did a wonderful study on this using non-Western sources demonstrating that the victims tend to be fellow Muslims, right? And it tends to be Salafi jihadist groups. Some affiliated with Al-Qaeda, some independent, that sort of thing. So the next slide. So Bruce Hoffman traced it over time. Asaf Moghadam, a scholar of Salafi jihadism, you can see from 2000 to 2001 to 2007, the vast majority is these Salafi jihadist groups promulgating terrorist attacks. and most of it actually happening outside the United States, in the Middle East, and then of course in Asia, Pakistan, India, and Indonesia. However, so I'm trying to give you sort of the balancing back and forth about the role of religious actors and religion in some of these fights, and how it sort of gets implicated in the fights. Religious actors have also been highly involved in sort of militating for peace. The Society of San Egidio, I don't know if anybody knows it, it's a Catholic lay organization. They spend decades within conflict-prone societies, and they become friends, and they form networks, and they have incredible local knowledge and information, so that when a moment emerges for peace to be negotiated, they're there. And they're probably, their most successful case was Mozambique, and they brought an end to that civil war. And so we tracked the cases of successful mediation, and it turns out that from '89 to 2005, there were 21 cases. Religious actors had a heavy hand, just as in democratization, they were involved in 62% in 17 out of the 21 cases. And Dan Philpott just finishing a book on this part of our findings now. So religious actors have been both, militants for peace, but also the use of violence. So that's the last is the democratization, and then how democratization is related to violence and peace. The last trend that I noted is globalization. And so why is it that religious actors have been able to harness this when modernization theorists thought they're backward, conservative, not going to like change? Well, it turns out that they were probably one of the most successful in adapting to the globalization trends. And part of it is because they're transnational actors, right? Where is the Catholic Church? It's not necessarily in Rome. It's where the followers are. It's where the people are. That's the church, right? And so they can go, so religious actors are very good at sort of harnessing across borders and connecting with fellow followers. If you look at, the cost of communication, if you look at the cost of transport, the container ship profoundly changed transport in this world. No longer do you have to have stevedores and nets and cranes. Now you could just put a container on a ship. The container can go on a train. The train can go, into Worcester, be unloaded and dropped off at Costco, right? So it's a very different world, and religious actors were sort of, they were seeing this and able to respond to it. So next slide. And here's the slide. So this shows the intensification. So we make the argument that the quantity actually led to a qualitative shift. This is data on the World Bank, and you can see ocean freight, air travel, right? The ability of people to air travel. My kids have frequent flyer miles. I couldn't imagine. As a kid, the first time I got on a plane was when I went in the Army. My kids have been all over the world. We live in a very different world. Transatlantic phone, right? The old days we had underwater sea cables. Now we have satellite. And satellite, you can see, came up in the late 1970s, 80s. And it's transformed the world. And the ability of people to communicate, mobilize, and again, we can talk about the Arab Spring. We saw that there actualized. Now the question is whether it's going to help to govern. It helps to mobilize, but whether it can help to govern is a different question. So next slide. All right, so trends in relation to politics, I'm sort of wrapping up. Modernization in the developing world did not lead to secularization. It actually led to an intensification of demand for religion to become more public, for people not to hide their faith, or to keep it as a private matter. Democratization allowed for religious minorities and majorities to sort of challenge existing political authorities. And they did, and in many corners of the world. And then globalization allowed for the efficient transmission of ideas worldwide. And again, as transnational actors, I think IR scholars have missed this, right? Just like corporations, they had the ability, much more so, to be able to capitalize on this and challenge states both from without, but then of course from within. And so one of our, the big points that we make in the book is that religion has always been present, and it's likely to stay there and perhaps intensify into the next decade. Because the people who make the argument, they like us to believe that this intensification, this resurgence of religion was starting at a baseline, at a zero. And we say, no, it was probably around, if you want to go 0 to 100, it was probably like 30, and now we're up at 50 and 60%. Not every corner of the world is, highly religious and demanding this. We see the counter reaction in Europe, right? The Europeans are sort of trying to deal with their Muslim populations Muslim societies have a very different relationship to their faith. And European societies are largely Christian, they have Christian traditions, and they went through the wars of religion, they went through the treaties of Westphalia where you have separation of church and state, they're now having to deal with populations within their borders that are saying, no, maybe there should be a different way that we can relate our religion to the church. And so the implication, we just say, get over it. One of the things that I've had to deal with, I teach at the Kennedy School. Most of my students are master's students, incredibly talented and worldly. And shockingly, one day, one of my students who was non-American came up to me and asked me why Brian Hare, who's a professor at the Kennedy School, but he also happens to be an ordained Catholic priest, wears the same outfit every day. And my jaw dropped. I was like, really? And I said, he's an ordained Catholic priest. That's his priest suit. And so I think one of the reasons why people sort of shuffle religion off is they just don't know a lot about it, and they're nervous about it. So either they didn't get a religious education, or they weren't raised in a religious household and they don't know their own faith, or they don't know that of other faiths. And we hope to remedy that, by teaching courses and that sort of thing. And telling people that actually it's really in your interest to learn more about this issue. And then also, one of the things in the book that emerges out of this is sort of the ambivalence of religion. One of my favorite books that when I came to this was Scott Appleby's book called The Ambivalence of the Sacred, because it so captures the nature of religion. First of all, I've sort of personified religion. It's people that bring religion into the political arena. It's not religion on its own, right? So people bring it, and they bring it in different ways. Some people bring it to bring peace and mediation. Senator John Danforth, ordained minister, his faith helped to bring peace in Sudan. He was trusted, and the Sudanese made that quite clear. They were comforted, even though you have a Muslim north and a Christian south, but also animist south. The fact that this was a religious figure meant that he had some moral code. He had a code for them, right? That he could bring that into the arena and help mediate peace. And it was part of the reason why they were able to get peace in 2005. Saying that, we don't want to exaggerate the role of religion. We don't think, it's not like hammers and nails. We don't see nails everywhere. The Arab Spring, there was not a heavy religious basis to it. Now we're starting to see the negotiation of Muslim Brotherhood, the big question, and people are knocking on our doors. What about this Muslim Brotherhood? Shouldn't we be scared? We say, well, maybe a little. Some of them are pretty extremist, and they have very, conservative views and views that we find distasteful toward women and to other religious minorities. But there are others in the Muslim Brotherhood that are quite enlightened. And it turns out that actually when Islamist parties compete in power, they tend to moderate their views. And one of our key takeaways in the book is let them compete in power. You have two options as states. You either can exclude them from political power, and that's where you get extremism. Al-Qaeda emerged out of the domestic politics of Saudi Arabia. Right? They were not allowed to express themselves. They were kept down. They did not agree with sort of the Wahhabist variant of Islam that the Saudi state was promulgating. And so they ended up sort of challenging the Saudi state at some point, and then were highly repressed, and then they exported sort of this global jihad. So the point is you can either exclude, and our argument is the probability, we talk in probabilistic statements, is that you're going to get more extremist views, or you can include them and try to get them to temper their views. And then conditionally, you have to renounce violence, right? You have to be willing to use the ballot box, right, and political platforms. You cannot use violence. If you use violence, then of course that goes against the political, normal operation of politics. And then we expect religious actors to stay. And again, part of this is population trends, but also a part of it is that people are more comfortable, globally speaking, not just in the United States, but in the United States we see it, speaking about their faith. Even though when I get on the radio, and I was on NPR a couple weeks ago, and the first caller calls up and says, I really find this conversation really unnerving and unacceptable, because this particular woman was uncomfortable talking about faith. She thought it was inappropriate. And we're saying, no, actually, if people want to talk about it, they have a right to. It's freedom of conscience, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do what I say, but at least people should be able to express their opinion. So last slide. So in conclusion, religion is not disappearing or declining. everywhere. It's declining in some corners of the world, but not everywhere. Although it may be dictatorial and divisive, and when I say it, I'm saying that people might use it for dictatorial purposes or to divide populations. I'm not implicating religion. It happens under very certain conditions, and we lay those out in the book. And it's the degree of freedom of religious actors within societies, right? Can they operate? Can they freely operate and be part of the political arena? If they can't, then chances are they're going to take it outside the normal course of politics. Therefore, we make the argument that 4Ds is not a fair set of grades. Again, the record is more ambivalent. We're not saying it's all rosy. I'm not wearing rose-colored glasses, but it's not as harsh a picture as I think some people with the conventional wisdom would have us believe. So I'll end it there.
On the question, though, of, and part of the body of literature that this, of course, answers and refutes is the idea that so much of what we see in the rise of religion in politics is a kind of reactionary backlash against modernization, secularization, the exposure to ideas and values that might be very disturbing to traditions and so forth. I wonder, though, whether your conclusions aren't to some extent consistent with those causal arguments in some ways. I mean, you argue that religious groups have used modernization very effectively under the modernization party. You said that as transnational non-state actors, they're able to use these technologies in ways to mobilize and spread values and so forth. But does that sort of utilitarian embrace of the technology means of modernization necessarily exclude the possibility that what they want to mobilize and what they hope to accomplish is nevertheless still somewhat of a backlash against what modernization has otherwise brought, what modernization has otherwise exposed them to. Back to Sam Huntington's idea that, gee, you know, the world is in fact becoming a smaller place, but instead of making everyone very empathetic and understanding about other cultures, it's bringing people into contact with cultures and ideas that they find distasteful. And the very mechanism through which they come in contact with those ideas allows them to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is read the whole book, Ward. Because I think what we're trying to do is sort of correct that. I think there are, so, you know, we look at all of the cases of democratization, and there are counter-democratizers, and I think that that's what you're talking about. These people are sort of reactionary against sort of challenges to the traditional system, traditional centers of authority and that sort of thing, political and social authority and economic, right? But I have to say, looking at the data, you know, the data, and I'm only talking about this from 72 to 2009, these democratization, the majority of them were quite progressive. So the idea that individual liberty needs to be protected, freedom of conscience, regardless of faith, right? And part of it, you know, one of the things that we had to deal with was that the Catholic Church was actually at the forefront of this as the result of the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, and the idea that that human rights need to be protected, and then liberation theology sort of emerging among Catholics. And so it actually is quite progressive in the idea that the individual human rights need to be protected regardless of faith. And so of the 78 cases, you know, the majority were progressive, forward-thinking, protecting the individual, including women's rights and equality of women and that sort of thing. Not completely, but better than it was. And then there were only 10 cases of sort of counter-democratizing. And the mother of them all there, of course, is Iran. And the other one is the Taliban, right? I'm quite concerned about the Taliban. As an IR scholar, international relations scholar interested in security studies, I look at Afghanistan and I think we have no hope. All right, this is it has never been governed centrally. That's all we know how to install. That's why Iraq will probably make it, but Afghanistan will not. Yet then I think about the women, right? Because this regime is going to impose a regime. You know, they're going to pull back on all of the rights and freedoms that we've managed to put in place. So I think what I'd say to you is that we're trying to sort of correct that. And we're saying part of that story is correct. There are some of these that are being reactionary, they're fighting back. They don't want their traditions, their values, beliefs unsettled and threatened. But there are others that are saying, no, no, we can actually adapt to this, that we can, that are you know, and this debate is really having in Islam. Is Islam compatible? The big question is Islam compatible with democracy? And some scholars make the case that yes, indeed they are, and other scholars say no, it's going to be a real challenge because there's no separation of temporal from religious authority. So I would say is what we're trying to do in this book is lay out which of the actors sort of follow the old school of thought, and then which of the actors actually are more progressive. And I have to say, I was struck when we were doing the democratization stuff, how many were actually quite progressive. And many of them were coming out of the Catholic tradition, these religious actors. And why it was an issue for us is we didn't want this to be a, you know, we wanted examples. And actually there were a couple of examples. Indonesia, the Islamic-based parties in Indonesia were able to actually challenge the autocratic system and be there as an alternative, and they did. So we have some examples, and part of it is because democratization hasn't hit that part of the world. We're now seeing it in the Arab world, people demanding more transparency and accountability, but we are in the early days. I don't think in any one of those states yet have we seen a true revolution. There has not been. I mean, look at Egypt, just yesterday or 2 days ago, the military is, trying to retain even more, or get control of even more power in Egypt. And then, of course, the Christian Copt, broader Egyptian society. And if there's ever a community that's Egyptian, it's the Christian Copt community. And sort of the evidence seems to be that somebody within the Egyptian establishment is allowing for the Egyptian Copts as a way for the government, the ruling authorities, to say, oh, see, you need us to impose order. But in any event, so what I'd say is, I think part of your story is correct. Looking at the evidence that we looked at from '72, I think it's a minority, actually. I think that most truly enlightened religious actors are quite progressive. And part of it, I think a large part of it is the recognition of basic human dignity, freedom of conscience, the ability to, practice your faith. And I mean, think about the establishment of this country. It was the idea that people should be able to, they're running away from religious persecution, which is why we have some of the largest protections on the ability to practice whatever faith you have.
Appreciate very much your presentation and thesis, but could we say that from both sides of the spectrum, what we is trying to do is kind of giving an identity to the group, whether it is on the conservative or the defensive side, or it is on the modernizing side.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately what is trying to give an identity, and in the case of religion, because it gives a kind of a primordial identity, apart from nation state and party politics and all that, that seems to be more lasting. So it's basically a question of identity. It's not a question of religion per se.
No, I think that's right. I mean, as a student of so I came into this through identity, so studying ethnic violence, ethnic conflict, and ethnicity is an identity marker, right? And it could be language, race, religion, culture, region, depending upon where you're from. And that really matters. And I'm trained as a political scientist, and so you want to look at, okay, how are aggregations of ideas sort of brought into the political arena, and then what groups represent them, right? And in many societies, identity cleavages is one way of doing that, and religion is one of those cleavages, one of those identities that helps to differentiate populations and then how their voice is heard in the political arena. So I wouldn't deny that. I mean, it's sort of a functionalist argument. But there are some very important aspects to individual faith beyond the functionalist sort of what religion can do in the sense of what religion asks people to do in terms of sacrifice, and what people think they're doing. If they really believe that they're doing some sort of divine will, they may be willing to make sacrifices that are more profound than other kinds of actors. And And I think the data, and do things that and so one of the things I've been looking at is religiously inspired violence different than non-religious? Is it more brutal? Do they target, different things and that sort of thing? So I think that you also want to look at the belief side of not only the functional institutionalists, how it helps set up identities, but also the belief side of things and how it motivates individuals to say, yes, I want to be part of that group and not part of that group. Because we are, in the book, quite conscious that even within, let's say, Catholicism, there's charismatic Catholics. I mean, there's all different kinds of Muslims, Shia versus Sunni, Ismailis. And, Sunnis want to deny that Ismailis and Shia are true Muslims. And in some societies that matters for the politics and that sort of thing. But the point is that, yes, that's one aspect of religion that's very important. But there are others.
I have a question about the Catholic Church specifically. I guess, understanding obviously that it's a broad umbrella, have you found anything to suggest that in its efforts to use its authority as a normative entrepreneur, it's moved more towards pacifism and attempts at reconciliation and mediation rather than trying to articulate the just war tradition that it's historically held? Do you see it maybe in a transitional mode towards an effective pacifism?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not an expert on the Catholic Church. What I would say is that it really depends upon the societies in which it's operating, because it is this huge organization. And in the United States, you've got the bishops but there are important, it matters who the Pope is. I mean, it really mattered John Paul, and he really did see himself on a moral mission to sort of free the oppressed. And he really helped to do that in Eastern Europe. We don't want to underestimate that. And I have some of my IR scholar friends, who state-to-state relations is all that matters, and they want to diminish the power of the Pope and his charismatic authority. But I lived in Germany at the time, and I remember when this is West Germany at the time, I remember when he came to visit, the masses of people, and I'm sure it's, some of you went to some of his visits, when he came, wherever, when he did his visits. So what I would say is it depends, because even sort of with Vatican II, some lay and clerical authorities within this. So in Brazil, the question is, are they aligned with the state or not? And so there is some freedom of movement. And so for us, a very critical aspect of this is looking at the relationship of religious actors, Catholic, non-Catholic, and how they're sort of controlled or contained by the states in which they're living. We also do look, more transnationally at the church, but that's in terms of the large-scale sort of papers or, covenants that they're releasing at a given moment. So it's contingent, is what I would say.
If religion is not disappearing or declining, why does there seem to be, or why are so many places of worship being forced to consolidate or even shut down?
It's a great question. Some are, and we can talk about Catholicism and mainline Protestantism, right? Is sort of, Catholicism is actually holding on to its numbers, but some scholars say that's because once you're baptized, you're on the rolls, and that if you convert, that's not getting caught. And so we have to wait a couple more decades to see if that's the case. And what's happening is that people are shifting into sort of the more institutionally based. So they're still Christian, they're just not Catholic, they're just not Methodist, they're Pentecostal, evangelical of some form. And so you're seeing a shift. And this is particularly in Latin America, and now in Africa, you're seeing evangelical and Pentecostalism really take off, and China too. Some people say that the number of Christians in China, we actually have it undercounted, because the Chinese government would never let us know the true count. So Todd and Brian, they have the best data. They're the ones that track all these figures. And their numbers show quite clearly, actually, that yes, broadly speaking, the number of Christians is sort of increasing. Where it's declining is within Christianity, certain churches, and it's the more established churches. And Catholicism is one of them. I mean, my kids are in the last Catholic school in Cambridge. I think there used to be 9 elementary schools in Cambridge. We're down to 1. So, within the United States, and particularly the Northeast, you do see this, but Go to the South, right? You see mega churches and sort of the evangelical movement, Baptists, and Pentecostal are very, very strong.
In Latin America, which is traditionally Catholic, and there's a big evangelical movement, do you see that movement affecting the politics that are happening now?
It's interesting. It's really, so when the evangelicals really started making headway, actually Peter Berger has this great piece called Max Weber is Alive and Well in Guatemala. And most people predicted actually that this was a social movement, that it wasn't going to be political and they weren't going to sort of make demands in the political arena. But now we are starting to see politicians emerging, mayors, and that sort of thing. And what's so the argument is that actually it is becoming more politicized. It's still too soon to tell. It takes time. You've got to get people organized. What's interesting about the evangelical movement is that it's why he said Max Weber is alive and well is that it's really helped to drive the economy. That actually, when people become, faithful, particularly men, there's this great book called The End of Machismo, right, about how the evangelical movement is helping in Latin America because men are becoming more responsible. They're coming home. They're not drinking their paycheck. And then also it's very equalizing for women, that women are allowed to be part of the organization. They're getting leadership skills, management skills, and that sort of thing. So as a social movement, it's quite clear that it's helpful. It's sort of an end to the economy. Some scholars are studying China, that actually China is not as hostile because it's providing social services in some communities, especially in the rural areas. But also it's helping to drive the economy, again, because people are becoming more efficient workers. What is China's #1 fear? Internal unrest. That is it. It's not the United States. It's not Japan. It's not North. It's internal unrest. And how are they going to, keep internal unrest at bay? Keep driving that economy and keeping those consumers happy. And so, some of my friends, I haven't studied this personally, say that actually the Chinese government is looking at this as a phenomenon. However, they will not allow it to become political because they don't want alternative sources of authority. But you are now starting to see in some corners in Latin America where people are they're politicians now who are outspokenly evangelical and saying that, okay, we need to have some sort of moral code and politics based on this moral code as a result. But it's still relatively new. It takes a long time for these sort of sentiments and traditions to take hold, because they're cultures. I don't want to say they're civilizations. They're cultural shifts that are happening over time. So.
Would you say that the U.S. is becoming more or less religious?
Well, the United States is sort of static. What the data show is that the United States is pretty much staying the same, and that we're promiscuous. That Christian Americans are promiscuous. That we switch in and out of Christian traditions. So as a Catholic, I'm more apt to become a Protestant or an Anglican or evangelical. But the numbers are fairly flat, actually, in the United States, which doesn't necessarily go against our book because it's one country. And then also there could be sort of, it's really interesting to look at the atheist movement, so Dawkins and Hitchens, and it's really gotten people to sort of fight back to say, okay, I don't have faith. What does this mean, and sort of defending that. So now more people are willing to say that they're atheist, agnostic. The same thing, I don't have the chart here, showing that once China sort of allowed more freely for people to declare their faith, the proportion of atheists has dropped, right? And I think in the United States, people are saying, okay, if you're going to tell me you're more religious, I'm going to tell you I don't believe in God. And so I think that's, again, we're seeing some of this shaking out, this sorting out.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. It was great.